Good afternoon and welcome to the May edition of Real Talk Economics. My name is Markus Kuger and I'm the Chief Economic Advisor at Baker Ing. We are a global accounts receivables management company assisting our clients in cash flow management and collecting overdue debt. The topic of today's event is Germany, my home country. And I've selected that topic because government changed yesterday here in Germany. Friedrich Merz took over from Olaf Scholz as Chancellor, but it wasn't plain sailing in Parliament. It took Friedrich Merz 2 rounds to get elected. His coalition didn't have a majority in the first round of voting, which was rather surprising and is unprecedented in German history. And it just gives an indication of how fragile things have become, even in a once stable democracy like Germany. Let me get up the slides so you can see them. As mentioned, I want to talk about Germany today, dubbed as the new sick man of Europe. It was called the sick man of Europe 20 years ago. Then things changed. The country implemented reforms, but now, unfortunately, the situation has deteriorated again. And we will talk about that towards the end of my slides, because I want to begin with the usual topics. For those of you that have tuned in the past, I will start with macroeconomics. We'll talk about global trends. Then next chapter is geopolitics. I think you cannot really talk about the economy without looking at political developments. That won't change anytime soon, at least as long as Donald Trump is in the White House. And then we will look at business failures and payments performance data as well before we talk about the challenges the German economy is facing. As always, I'd encourage you to engage with me, to interact with me. So if you have any questions, please use the comments function here in the LinkedIn live stream, and I will address these questions at the end of today's event. So let's start with macroeconomics, and let's have a look at some high frequency data from the US and Europe. And here on the left-hand side, we can see the S&P 500. When I created the deck 2 days ago, the S&P 500, which is one of the major stock indices for the US economy, it hadn't fully recovered from the shock in early April when Donald Trump announced tariffs. But since I created the deck, things have actually improved further. So the S&P 500 is back to its early April reading. But as you can see from the chart, it's still a long way to go until the January and February readings. And this isn't only a US phenomenon. We are seeing that in many other stock markets around the globe as well. So things have improved over the past few weeks, but we're still down from the beginning of 2025. When we look at FX markets, we can see that the dollar hasn't appreciated yet against the euro. It hasn't appreciated against other currencies either. The dollar has actually appreciated after the election of Donald Trump. Markets were quite enthusiastic about his return to the presidency. But once he started to implement policies or he announced certain policies, FX market became nervous and the dollar has actually lost substantially against other major global currencies. So this is a trend that has reversed in the past few weeks. When we look at consumer confidence, we can see that consumers in the US are still getting more and more pessimistic. And here on that chart, we can see two different lines. Let's start with the darker one, the present situation index. We can see that American households are assessing their current situation increasingly more pessimistic. But obviously the big movement is in the light blue line, which is the expectations index. So households are asked, how confident are you about the next 12 months? And here we are seeing a sizable drop that has occurred over the past few months. We have to be a bit careful here. Like everything in the US, things have become more partisan. So when survey respondents vote Republican, then they tend to assess the current situation as good. If there are Democrats, they tend to assess the current situation and the outlook as rather negative. And that is very similar to the situation a year ago when Joe Biden was still in charge. Back then, the Democrats were rather optimistic and Republican voters were fairly pessimistic. So the companies or the institutions that are running these surveys have to factor that in. But the general tone is that American consumers are becoming less optimistic, more pessimistic, and that is mainly driven by the expectations component here. But it's not only in the US where consumers are becoming more pessimistic. This is a global trend, at least in developed economies. In the EU, we are seeing a very similar development. We can see massive spikes here and drops, first because of COVID, then because of the cost of living crisis. But since 2022, consumer confidence in the EU had actually improved. At least that trend lasted until the end of 2024. But since then, EU consumers, they have become more pessimistic again. And we are seeing a very similar development in the UK. UK consumer confidence had already taken a hit around the autumn budget last year. And since then, it has either moved sideways or gradually downwards. So British consumers are also becoming less optimistic and more pessimistic. When we approach the topic from a global perspective, and we're using the OECD's Global Consumer Confidence Index, we can see that, of course, things improved compared against 2022 and compared against 2023. But this improvement process has come to a halt on a global scale as well. And recent months have only seen sideways development. So in a nutshell, it is unlikely that consumers will fork out sizable amounts of money anytime soon for big ticket items, simply because of the high level of uncertainty. Looking at the business side of things and starting with the US again, the picture isn't too different. Generally speaking, business confidence is moving in the wrong direction. The US PMI composite output, let me first explain what that means. PMI, Purchasing Managers Index, one of the most widely used indicators amongst us economists. The range is 0 to 100. 100 is the best reading, 0 is the worst reading, which makes 50 the neutral line. Readings above 50 are hence good. Readings below 50 are bad. Composite means we're combining the manufacturing sector and the service sector. So the US PMI composite output in April stood at 51.2 points. That is above the growth threshold, above 50. That's the good news, but it is down from the 53.5 points recorded in March, and it is actually the worst reading in 16 months. So that's the bad news here. Service sector output has fallen for the second month in a row, still stands in growth territory, though in manufacturing, different picture, but manufacturing is very difficult at the moment because it has been distorted. A lot of manufacturing companies in the US, they have front-loaded purchasing activities recently. That was because they were concerned of the introduction of tariffs. So the manufacturing PMI in the UK isn't really a useful indicator at the moment. But now with the tariffs being brought in, at least some of them, we can probably see a normalization of the manufacturing PMI in the US. Problematically, there is a component in that PMI that checks future sentiment, business expectations, if you want to call it that way. And that future sentiment component on a composite level has fallen for the third consecutive month. And it has actually fallen to the lowest reading since mid-2022. So in other words, American companies are rather downbeat about the 12 months ahead. However, there's a clear split between manufacturers. They're generally optimistic, and service sector companies. They tend to be pessimistic. It's not a surprise. Manufacturers will be protected by tariffs against foreign competitors. So that should favor them. But of course, tariffs will have negative impact on their supply chains as well. We will come to that later. Let's have a look at the Eurozone. And we're looking at the composite output PMI here as well. And it stands at 50.4 points. Above 50, that's the good news, but just above 50. It's a 2-month low, so things have not improved recently. Quite the opposite, things have become worse. When we look at the service sector PMI, that is in growth territory as well, but just by a whisker, 50.1 points. And that is actually the poorest reading in 5 months. Manufacturing, different story. Well, 2 tails here. The first tail is things have improved. It's actually the best reading in 32 months now. But the bad news is that it is still below the 50 points threshold. It is still in contraction territory, 49 points here. But within the European manufacturing sector, there are countries that are doing well. For example, in Greece, it's comfortably in growth territory, 53 points. And then there are countries like Austria, where the reading is below 47 points. In manufacturing, we have seen fairly solid new order inflow that is coming from within the Eurozone. That has actually risen to a 3-year high. So that component is doing well, but unfortunately the export orders that are coming from outside the Eurozone, they are continuing to disappoint. Though similar to the US, the forward-looking component hasn't really improved. In fact, it has deteriorated. The composite year ahead expectations component has now dropped to the lowest reading in 1.5 years. So not good news for the European business sector. If you know me, if you've attended my presentations in the past, you probably know that I tend to be rather pessimistic. I think as an economist and as a German national, that's in my DNA. But even I have to admit that there are certain economic indicators that are still looking okay, that are still encouraging. One of them is the labor market. We're not covering that today, but unemployment is still no problem. And the other time series or data series that is still encouraging is inflation. Inflation continues to come down. In fact, in the Eurozone, it reached 2.2% recently. That's the most recent figure. And that is pretty much in line with the European Central Bank's inflation target, which stands at 2%. That's also the Bank of England's inflation target. In fact, 2% is the inflation target of most developed economies. Core inflation in the Eurozone is a bit higher. Core inflation ignores price developments for energy and unprocessed food because they tend to be very volatile. So if you want to call it that way, core inflation is a bit more stable. It's higher, but again, it's not far away from the 2% target. We still continue to see a sizable split between goods inflation and service inflation. Goods inflation in the Eurozone stands at 0.6%, while service sector inflation stands at almost 4%. In the UK, very similar picture, maybe not as good as in the Eurozone, but fairly comparable. UK inflation in March, CPI, Consumer Price Index, increased 2.6%. CPIH, the H stands for housing. It includes a certain housing cost component that isn't included in the CPI. The Bank of England and the ONS, they love CPIH. I prefer CPI. But CPIH is slightly higher because housing costs have risen. Services associated to refurbishment of properties, they have gone up more faster. So it's a bit higher. It's 3.4%. Core inflation is also 3.4%. But yeah, you can see we are far away from these double-digit inflation rates that we've seen 2 years ago, 3 years ago. But similar to the European cousins, continental European cousins, the UK is experiencing a huge difference between service sector inflation and goods inflation. Goods inflation is the same as the Eurozone, 0.6%. but service sector inflation is even higher, 4.7%. Positively, inflation expectations are well anchored and moderate. What does it mean? It basically means that markets are not expecting inflation to rise significantly. In fact, markets expect inflation in the Eurozone, that is, in 2026 to be around 2.9%. And for 2028, markets expect an inflation rate of 2.5%. So that's above the ECB's 2% target, but it's not far off. And that also means that central banks will have some room to maneuver. They are in a position to lower interest rates further. And as I've already mentioned interest rates, let's have a look at what has happened to them. I've already mentioned it. Inflation has come down across the globe pretty much, and that enabled central banks to cut rates. The Bank of England has done that already. The Federal Reserve has done that already. The ECB has done that already. The Swiss National Bank has done that already, either last year or this year, or in some cases, actually, rates were cut in early 2025 already. So as you can see from the chart, which shows the interest rate on new corporate loans in the Eurozone, could have picked the UK equivalent, would have been a very similar chart. You can see that interest rates have started to come down. That's visible at the right-hand end of this chart. But you can also see that it's still a long way to go for them to reach these pre-COVID readings again. So yeah, despite the recent cuts, interest rates are still high above the levels seen in 2009 to 2022. So if you're a company or a household as well, it doesn't only apply to companies, then your interest rate bill is probably higher than 5 years ago or 10 years ago, with negative consequences on credit risk. And it's not only interest rates that are problematic, it's also lending terms. Lending terms have tightened over the past few years, so getting access to credit has become more complicated as well. Let's change the angle and have a look at real GDP growth. And this slide is fairly up to date. It is from the latest World Economic Outlook that has been released by the IMF, International Monetary Fund, in April. So it's just a few weeks old. And have a look at the world growth forecast, that light blue box at the left-hand side. Last year, global economy expanded by 3.3%. For this year, the IMF forecasts 2.8% growth before we will see a modest acceleration again to 3% next year. So before we go any further, I have to tell you that 3.3% growth last year wasn't particularly good. It was unchanged, more or less, from the 2023 figure. It is a very disappointing global growth forecast. Well, it's not a forecast, it's an historic figure. So 3% global growth isn't good. And from an already low figure, things are now getting worse. And I also have to tell you that the IMF has severely lowered this global growth forecast compared with the latest, or the last World Economic Outlook, which was published in October last year, so before Donald Trump was elected. And one of the main victims of the recent downgrades is actually the US. US growth is now forecasted to come in at 1.8%. In October last year, the forecast stood at 2.7%. So from 2.7% in October, that was the October forecast, to now 1.8%. China, you can't see here, so I will tell you the figures. In October, the IMF had forecasted 4.6% growth for China this year. Now it expects the Chinese economy to grow by 4% only. So 0.6 percentage point downward revision. The UK, also not included in this chart as we're looking at regions, and the US. UK growth forecast was 1.6% in October. Now it's down to 1.1%. So 50 basis point downward revision. And in the Eurozone, we can see here 0.8% growth forecast for this year. 6 months ago, the IMF had predicted growth of 1%, so 20 basis point downward revision. Every major economy, every region has seen a downward revision to growth forecast in the latest IMF World Economic Outlook, and global growth as a consequence is now coming in at 2.8% this year. In October, the fund had still predicted 3.3% growth, I believe. So that is quite a significant change within a few months. And why is that? Well, it has something to do with politics, of course, which is a nice segue into the next chapter. And I will show you a few charts here. And we start with the Economic Policy Uncertainty Index. It's basically an index that tracks certain keywords in certain newspapers around the globe, and it then gets weighted by the size of the country. So in other words, if certain words appear in a headline in a big US newspaper, that counts more than if it appears in an Italian newspaper or in a Spanish newspaper. But the important bit here is obviously the overall development here. You can see that the Economic Policy Uncertainty Index has been skyrocketing in recent weeks. That's not a surprise. The trade war escalates. Donald Trump is making announcements on a more or less daily basis. Certain countries are retaliating. It is creating a huge layer of uncertainty, which is harmful for businesses as well as households. There is a subcomponent to that Economic Policy Uncertainty Index, and that one is called Trade Policy Uncertainty Index. So they're looking for even more specialized keywords here, and that index goes back to the 1980s. And you can see that not a lot of things have changed up until COVID. Then COVID came, and there was huge uncertainty about the reliability of supply chains, the viability of supply chains. Lockdown measures caused a lot of problems there. Things normalized on a higher basis, but still, compared with the COVID lockdowns, things improved. And then, of course, recent weeks, we're seeing an explosion of that index. And that doesn't necessarily mean that companies or households are responding to it, but we've seen the sentiment readings as well. I think there is no doubt that uncertainty is high, and uncertainty is not good for business planning or for long-term consumption plans on the household side. And I've already mentioned for why that uncertainty has gone up. It's simply because of the policies that are coming out of Washington. The threat of a trade war is real. The US administration has already implemented several measures. They increased tariffs on imports from Canada, Mexico, China. They've increased tariffs on aluminium and steel imports. So measures were already put in place early on, and that then culminated in the announcements on 2nd of April, when Donald Trump stood in the White House garden with his chart, and basically countries that were running huge trade surpluses with the US, they were punished severely with higher tariff rates. So, for example, Cambodia, which has a huge surplus because they sell a lot to the US and don't buy a lot from the US, they are now facing a 49% tariff. I think Indonesia, Bangladesh, they also saw increases, massive increases. Tariffs there were around 40%. But the bigger economies, bigger regions, they were also hit hard. Every country was hit with a 10% blanket tariff, and then the bigger your trade surplus was, the bigger the tariff was. Wasn't really calculated with a scientific approach, but it was easy to understand. And yeah, the EU has actually seen an increase of its effective tariff rate when trading with the US from 2% before Donald Trump took office to now 17%. China, unsurprisingly, was hit very hard, and China retaliated immediately, which then caused another retaliation from the American side. So there was this tit for tat escalation going on, which basically meant that the tariff in Sino-US trade is now 125%. So if you're selling something from the US to China, you're facing 125% tariff. And if you're selling something from China to the US, you're also facing 125% tariff. Generally speaking, the average tariff for imports into the US would have risen from 3% before Donald Trump took office to 30%, which is incredibly high. In fact, it is the highest figure for the US in more than 120 years. If you remember the first slide of today's presentation, I've shown you the stock market developments, I've shown you the FX market developments, and you can see this massive dip or this massive change around 2nd of April. So it's not a surprise that markets didn't respond well to these announcements. And Donald Trump reacted within a week. He announced that he will partially suspend the newly announced measures for a 90-day grace period. So he hasn't taken them back. They're still due to come in July. And he hasn't removed the measures that he had implemented in the first few weeks of his presidency. So the higher tariffs on imports from China, from Mexico, from Canada, the additional tariffs on steel and aluminium, they're still in place. The only thing that has been postponed were these announcements made on the 2nd of April. However, and now we come to the chart here on the left-hand side, it's evident that a trade war will be extremely harmful. It will be harmful for the global economy, but the country that will be hit hardest is the US. And that is, I wouldn't say common sense, but that is the opinion of pretty much every economist that isn't employed by the US government. So academics, NGOs, the IMF, the World Bank, the OECD are very adamant that a trade war will be harmful for the global economy, but the biggest loser will be the US. And that is also the outcome of a recent study that was conducted by the Center for Economic Policy Research. They sit in Brussels. When I was working for the European Parliament, I attended many of their conferences, and they have tried to quantify the potential damage of a trade war. And of course, as always, it depends on the assumptions you're making. They are looking at different scenarios, the status quo, the full implementation of the measures that were announced on 2nd of April. And there's a worst case scenario, which is the full implementation of these measures plus retaliation. China has retaliated already. Other regions haven't really responded yet. And it's clear that the more severe the trade war gets between the US and other regions, the higher the damage will be. And you can see that the economic damage to China will be bigger than to the US, than to the euro area, but the biggest loser is the US. And depending on the severity of the trade war, costs could be around 2 to 4% of GDP. We have to be a bit careful here. Assumptions are always tricky to make. They might not be realistic. And I think the biggest problem here is that the situation is very fluid. It changes very, very frequently. And that's a part of the problem because it is so fluid, uncertainty is high, and neither companies nor households, nor policymakers can actually make medium to long-term business plans. They can't even make short-term business plans. So let's have a look at credit risk. Let me have a sip of tea first. And those of you that tune in regularly might be bored now because unfortunately the charts aren't updated. That's because I'm using quarterly data here and we haven't seen an update recently. So we're still looking at the average payment delay in Q4 2024. This is done in Bradstreet data. I hope that the Q1 data becomes available within the next few days, but when I prepared the slides, it still wasn't available. There tends to be a delay in preparing this data. And as I told you last time, in 2024, B2B payments performance in Europe has deteriorated slightly, not by much. It has actually just increased by 0.1 days. So at the end of 2024, the average payment delay, B2B, that is, in Europe stood at 12.2 days compared with 12.1 days at the beginning of the year. However, there were winners and losers. One of the winners was the UK. The UK has actually seen a sizable improvement in B2B payment patterns last year. It started the year with an average payment delay of 13 days. It finished the year with an average payment delay of 10.8 days. And that is the first time in 4 years that the UK reading is actually above or better than the European average. When there are winners, there are losers. One of the losers is France. France has been a loser for many years, at least in this B2B payments performance analysis. France has seen another deterioration last year. It started the year with a payment delay of around 15 days and finished the year with a payment delay of around 16 and a half days. Before COVID, it was 12.6 days. So within 5 years, payment delays in France have lengthened by 4 days. And I've been looking at the data for 15 years. Before I joined Baker Ring, I worked for Dun & Bradstreet, and I joined DNB in 2010. And back then, France was ranked 3rd or 4th. So since then, it has slipped. And now even Spain and Italy pay quicker than France. Or, well, we can't say it that way, because we would need to keep in mind the usual terms in that country. But we can say that the payment delays in France are longer than in Spain and Italy, which is rather worrying. Let's have a look at business failures here. And maybe we start with the right-hand side, because data there wasn't updated or hasn't been updated yet. We're looking at business bankruptcies in the EU and the Eurozone. And last year, the EU has seen a 4% increase in the number of business failures. The Eurozone has seen a 6% increase. And the three biggest economies, France, Italy, Germany, that's not the right order. Germany is the biggest, France is the second biggest, Italy is the third biggest. They have all seen double-digit increases. In England and Wales, the situation last year was more promising. In fact, the number of business failures in England and Wales dropped by around 5% last year, down from a 30-year high in 2023. But the problem is that when you look at Q1 data, you actually see that figures have started to rise again. We've seen a 3.4% year-on-year increase in the first 3 months of 2025. So that improvement that we've seen last year has already come to a halt, at least temporarily. What's the business failure outlook for 2025? Well, maybe let's reiterate that things have actually not performed nicely in 2024 and 2023. Insolvency figures have risen in most countries. And according to Allianz Trade's Global Insolvency Index, figures were actually up by 10%. So insolvency figures on a global scale in 2024 were 10% higher than in 2023. At the moment, that index is around 10 to 15% above the pre-COVID average. So it's not only that the number of business failures is rising, it's also that it's now above the levels that we've seen before COVID, which is rather concerning. What's the outlook for the rest of the year and going into 2026? I'd say conflicted. On the one hand, interest rates will continue to come down. We talked about that earlier. But then at the same time, growth forecasts are revised downwards, lending terms are tight. If you're rolling over medium and long-term debt, you're still facing a higher interest rate burden than before. So I think that the number of business failures will continue to rise. We've seen that in the UK. The UK is probably at risk as well. Not probably, it is at risk because of the incoming changes, or they have already come in, the changes from the autumn budget, higher operating costs, higher minimum wage, higher national security contributions, national insurance contribution. So that isn't helping British companies with cash flow, and that in turn will have a negative impact on credit risk. Allianz Trade, they forecast a 6% increase in business failures globally this year, followed by a 3% increase next year. And the countries that are most at risk, you can see here at the top right corner in this visual, which is from the Allianz Trade's latest global insolvency report. The worst performers are Brazil and Germany. Why are they the worst performers? Well, because they are coming from a very high level. Insolvency figures are already high. That's why they are in the right-hand column here. And Allianz Trade, and I think it's a fair assessment, at least for Germany, we'll come to that in a second, they expect figures to go up even further. That's why they are at the top. So the further you are at the top right, the riskier it gets. And yeah, unfortunately, business failures will be a problem that every credit managers need to keep an eye on, even probably closer than previously. Okay, that brings us to the final chapter of today's presentation. I try to be funny. I'm German, so I'm not sure if that worked. And I called it Achtung, Recession, Germany's Challenges. And for the next 10, 15 minutes or so, we will have a look at why Germany is struggling at the moment. What are the underlying factors? And we can see that Germany is struggling by looking at real GDP growth. Real GDP growth is still the most important indicator for us economists. If real GDP growth is going up, it means the economy is doing well. And if real GDP growth is going down, it means the economy isn't doing well. It's not that simple, but it is still a handy approach to things. And you can see that real GDP growth in Germany was actually fairly solid in the run-up to COVID. Then COVID came, we had a massive dip. That's not Germany specific. We've seen that globally. But the problem with Germany is that growth hasn't recovered post-COVID. Real GDP levels, if you adjust it for purchasing power, if you look at real GDP, not GDP, real GDP, at the end of 2024 was still pretty much what it was in 2019. So for 5 years, the German economy hasn't grown. And in fact, not only has the German economy not grown in 5 years, it has also shrunk in 2023, and it has also shrunk in 2024. And that's fairly, I wouldn't say unique, but it doesn't happen very often. The last time that the German economy has shrunk for 2 years in a row was 20 years ago. So quite rare. The outlook for 2025 isn't great either. In fact, the IMF has downgraded its growth forecast. We talked about that earlier. The global growth forecast was revised downwards. US, China, UK, every country has basically seen a downward revision. So Germany isn't alone in this case, but the problem is that German growth was already quite weak before that downward revision. The IMF had forecasted, I think it was 0.2 or 0.3% growth for Germany. Now they're expecting stagnation, zero growth in Germany. And I think that is too optimistic. I think the problems that Germany is facing, they're fairly severe. It will take many years until they are sorted out. And that means that I think Germany will shrink again this year. And if Germany shrinks for third year in a row, that is the first time since the Second World War, just to give you an idea of how bad things are. What's to blame for that lackluster economic performance? Investment is down. That applies to both machinery as well as construction. Private consumption, exports, they are moving sideways. The only noticeable contribution to growth at the moment is government spending, which can be quite problematic, I'd say, because if you use that money to finance consumption rather than investment, that isn't good news, because you're just basically burning money and you're increasing the government debt load. Why is Germany in trouble? Several reasons. One of them, energy costs. Energy costs are very high. They were very high and they have increased. Again, that's not Germany specific. That is a trend that has been accelerated by the Ukraine and Russia war that has started in 2022. When we look at electricity prices for non-household consumers in the EU, we can see that Germany has the third highest electricity prices for basically industrial consumers, far above the EU average, far above the Euro area average as well. It's not only electricity, it's natural gas as well. Natural gas prices have gone up rapidly in 2022. 2023, things have moderated to a certain degree again. But if you compare the current readings with the readings 5 years ago, we can see that Germany has seen a 140% increase in industrial gas prices. It's the second highest in the EU. I'm not sure why some countries have disappeared from that chart. Luxembourg should be ahead of Germany. You can't read that, but Germany is basically the second worst country. Why is that? That's because Germany has been historically very reliant on Russian gas, previously Soviet gas. Pipelines were first constructed in the 1970s, and that dependence on Russian gas increased significantly. By 2021, Germany was getting around 50% of its gas imports from Russia. That quickly dropped with the start of the war to 22% in 2022, and it's now at virtually zero. Germany has replaced these Russian gas imports with LNG imports. The German government was very quick in approving 3 LNG terminals at the German coast, but they came at a price that LNG gas is much more expensive than Russian gas. And yeah, we are seeing the consequence, 140% increase in natural gas prices, which is obviously very bad news for energy intensive sectors such as the chemicals industry. Let's change the angle. Different problem though. Political risk is rising, and that is mainly because of the increasing support for the fringes, for the far left, but to a much bigger degree for the AfD, the Alternative for Germany, the far right party, which isn't that old. It has only been set up, I think, 12 years ago. Just have a look at the two maps. I explain to you what you're looking at. On the left-hand side, you see the results from the 2025 election. Germany elected a new parliament a few months ago in February. And blue represents the AfD, the far right. Black represents the center right, the conservatives, the party of Friedrich Merz, who has been elected chancellor yesterday. And on the right-hand side, you see the election results from the 2021 election 4 years ago. And red represents the center left, the Social Democrats, the Labour Party, if you're from the UK. And we're looking at who has won the constituency. It doesn't mean that in the German parliament, there are now only conservatives and AfD MPs. The German voting system is very different to the British voting system. There is a first past the post component. That's why there are constituencies, but effectively it's a proportionate representation. So that means there are still a sizable amount of other MPs, the Greens, the left. But it just gives an idea of how strong the AfD has become over the past 4 years. They are completely dominating the eastern part of Germany, the former communist part, but they've also won several constituencies in the west of the country, especially in more run-down constituencies. I hope I'm not insulting people here, but the constituencies in the west that they've won, there are former mining towns hit hard by the industrial changes. So yeah, the AfD is doing particularly well, and we can also see that by the seat distribution in Parliament at the top right here. The AfD has secured around 20% of the votes. They have become the second biggest party in Parliament. It's their best result ever. And the only other party that has won seats in Parliament was the left, obviously from the far left of the political spectrum. And the left and the AfD combined, they now command more than a third of the seats in the Bundestag, in the lower house. And that is rather problematic because it means that the government cannot change the German constitution anymore without the support of either the far right or the far left. So that isn't good news. Yesterday, the new government was formed. The new government comprises of the CDU, which is the center right, led by Friedrich Merz, the new chancellor, and the Social Democrats. Previously, you would have called such a coalition the Grand Coalition, the big coalition, because it includes the two historically biggest parties in post-war Germany. In the 60s and the 70s, these two parties combined would have accounted for 90% of the seats in Parliament. But as you can see now, they just have a very, very slim majority. And we could already see the problems yesterday. Friedrich Merz failed to win the first round of the chancellor vote. Too many members of his own party or the coalition partner, it's unclear because it was a secret ballot. They voted against him, so he had to have another vote a few hours later. He managed to squeeze through, but it just gives you an idea that if the government doesn't have a majority in such an important vote, that doesn't really bode well for the next 4 years for the rest of that parliamentary term. Another problem is that obviously the far right and the far left have gained votes. The business-friendly party, the FDP, the Liberals, they have not cleared the 5% threshold that is required to secure seats in parliament. They've been ejected from parliament. They got 10% in the previous election. They were included in the previous government. They're now out of parliament, and they could dissolve, disintegrate over the next 2 years. And then there is another big problem as well, and we've probably seen it here when we look at the constituencies on the left-hand side. The AfD has become very, very strong in the east of the country, in Thuringia. There were state elections last year, and the AfD has become the strongest party there. I think around 35% of the votes. In Saxony, in Brandenburg, which is the area around Berlin, they are the second strongest party, and they're polling at around 30%. And given that they are not in the government, I think they will benefit even more from the developments of the next 2 years. So in other words, it will become increasingly complicated to form coalitions on a state level in the East that exclude the AfD. At the moment, the Conservatives, they still have a firewall in place. Brandmauer, Friedrich Merz is very adamant that there will be no coalition with the AfD. There will be no cooperation. They will not form a minority government and then hope that the AfD will support them. The leadership is very clear, but the CDU is running out of options. And I think eventually the firewall will crack because you cannot continue to form coalitions in the East that contain 4 parties, from the Conservatives to the Greens and the far left. I think it just gets too complicated, that will cause problems because policy making that includes the far right will be hugely disruptive for businesses as well. Although, at least at first glance, they are largely pro-business. The AfD was set up by a bunch of economist professors that opposed bailing out Greece during the Eurozone crisis. So it's still a very neoliberal party program if you ignore the let's leave the EU, let's leave the Eurozone, and let's ban immigration. But besides that, it's a small state, low tax, traditional far-right party. So let's have a look at a few other economic challenges as well, conscious of time. Generally speaking, Germany is facing huge demographic changes. Here on the left-hand side, we can see that Germany will be hit harder than any other G7 economy by demographic changes over the next 5 years, and we lose a lot of workers, and that's coming at a time when labor shortages are already a sizable problem. Less workers, higher labor shortages, higher contributions to the social security systems. The German government is already spending a lot of its money on pensions. That share will go up further, which means less money for other investment. Another problem that Germany is facing is infrastructure. It's increasingly dated. I was in Dresden a few weeks ago, and Dresden is famous because last year a bridge just collapsed in the middle of the night, fell into the river. Luckily, it was in the middle of the night, nobody died. But yeah, it just shows you that road infrastructure in Germany is crumbling, schools are falling apart. I think foreigners still think that the German railway is brilliant and trains are on time. I'd invite you to come to Germany. You will quickly realize that this isn't the case anymore. Deutsche Bahn, the German railway company, reported that only 2/3 of their trains were on time last year, which is the worst reading ever recorded. Digitalization has been neglected. Germany is still very old-fashioned economy. You have to go to the town hall, you have to fill in some papers rather than doing it online. And key industries like automotive, like chemicals, they are under immense pressure. They have not realized that demand patterns have shifted, and that is causing some havoc now. Generally speaking, Germany's business model is outdated, is broken. Germany's business model was getting cheap energy from Russia and then manufacturing machinery, cars, and selling that to China or the US. And each of these pillars is broken. The Russian gas is no longer coming to Germany. The replacement is much more expensive. At the same time, China is no longer an export market. China has evolved into a competitor on most export markets nowadays, and exporting to the US is not that simple anymore with Donald Trump being in the White House. And then there's also another problem. Germany has neglected defense spending like pretty much every Western European economy since the end of the Cold War. So now Germany needs to spend a lot of money on military equipment. The previous government had already agreed on that. The incoming government has already put aside a sizable chunk of money. In fact, Germany used to have a debt brake in its constitution. It's still in place, but they bypassed it. So now defense spending can, in theory, be unlimited. There won't be any consequences on it from a constitutional point of view. But ultimately the German approach of outsourcing external security to the US, that has come to an end, and there's talk about bringing back conscription, which will be hugely expensive as well. The only upside to Germany's economic challenges, and if you know me, you've probably realized that I'm pessimistic normally, but there is one upside, and that is the immense fiscal stimulus that is already underway. The government had already agreed, with the help of the Greens and the left party, to increase government spending immensely over the next years. So there will be investment in the army, there will be investment in infrastructure, there will be investment in digitalization. A new ministry for digitalization was created. So all of that will certainly bring some benefits, but unfortunately it will take some time until these benefits are felt. I didn't mention Germany in particular earlier when we looked at credit risk. I just wanted to remind everyone that is dealing with German companies that, yes, Germany is still paying its bills largely on time. But when we look at insolvencies, the situation, unfortunately, isn't that encouraging. The number of business failures in Germany has been rising for 3 years in a row now, according to the Statis, the German statistics office, and it has gone up by 22% in 2024. But that's not the full picture, because that just gives you the overall amount of companies that went bust last year. When you look at the amount of unpaid bills, the claims that came out of these insolvencies, that figure has actually risen by 140%, almost 140%. So that is even more concerning. Credit risk in Germany, you could have probably ignored it 10 years ago, but nowadays this is no longer the case. This was my last slide. Let me sum things up, and then a few questions have come in already. If you have some, please send them my way. Global growth, we've touched on that. It will be weaker than initially anticipated. The IMF has revised downwards growth forecasts for the US, particularly for the US, but also for China, for the UK, for the Eurozone, for Germany. No country was spared, and that isn't good for the 2025 outlook. The prospect of a global trade war, and the prospect has already started. Tariffs were increased by the US government in February and March. The measures that were announced in April are only temporarily suspended. They could come in July, nobody knows, but the global trade war is already having an effect on dented consumer as well as business confidence. Uncertainty levels have risen to unprecedented levels, and that in turn is undermining the willingness to invest and to consume. Inflation together with labor markets, is one of the few bright spots. Central banks will continue to cut rates. Wage growth is fairly strong. Service sector inflation is still high as well. So maybe these interest rate cuts will not be as sizable as initially anticipated. And credit risk, regardless if there will be interest rate cuts or how big they will be a topic that you need to monitor, because growth will be weak, lending conditions are tight, geopolitical risk will also be high. Germany, and I hope that became clear, is facing a very, very challenging near-term future. The business model is broken. Demographics will change very quickly. There's a huge influx of migrants, but unfortunately that doesn't really help the labor market immediately, because they are lacking the skills, starting with language skills, but also other more basic skills. So that's not a panacea. The fiscal stimulus package that is underway will help to mitigate some of these developments, but it will probably take another 5 years or so until you can feel that. So all in all, I think Germany is in for a nasty second half of this decade. So before we reach Q&A, let me remind you that, of course, you can connect with me on LinkedIn. You can connect with Bakering on LinkedIn to stay informed about recent updates, future events that we are hosting. And I'd also invite you to navigate to the Credit Hubs section on the Bakering homepage. There is a lot of free of charge content on it, from country risk analysis, geopolitical, macroeconomic trends, to sectoral papers. And then for credit managers, there are also country fact sheets, which deal with questions around collection practices, as well as the legal environment in a certain market. So if you haven't done so yet, please go to the Credit Hub section at Bakering. A few questions came in, so let's go through them. And I'd also invite you to send over suggestions for a special topic for the next Real Talk Economics session, which will take place in June. So, but now let's start with the Q&A. There's one question about whether the US will manage to bring home enough manufacturing to turn the trade war into a positive outcome. Yeah, that's obviously the assumption that Donald Trump is making. I think it is too optimistic. I think there's a reason for why manufacturing is taking place in low-cost countries like Vietnam or Indonesia or China. So manufacturing certain goods in the US will just become prohibitively more expensive, and I don't think that anybody will pay $2,000 for a TV or something. So I'm very careful. There's also a skill shortage in the US. If you increase the amount of deportations as well, you will aggravate that issue. So in a nutshell, I don't think it is a strategy that will work. Want to say unfortunately, but no, it's not unfortunate. I think it is just against economic theory. And yeah, I'd be surprised if it works. Next question. With regards to business failures, is it likely that the US will see the most significant numbers on this front? I think that the US is certainly not in a good position. Interest rates haven't come down yet. Central bank is under pressure to do so. I'm not sure if it will happen anytime soon. He might fire the governor and replace him with a crony. But yeah, given that growth will be hit the hardest in the US and the fact that interest rates haven't really changed, I think the US is not in a good place when it comes to business failures. There's one question, will it be noticeable for the Netherlands? I'm not sure what it refers to. So Michael, if you could clarify that in the next minute or so, and I will go to Christoph's question. Is there any positive outlook for Germany and the Eurozone? What's the expected time for the improvement actions to kick in? 3 years, 5 years, 10 years? Yes, I think it will take some time until these reforms, well, they still have to be agreed on. A lot of the compromises that were found between the center right and the center left in the coalition talks, they still need to be fleshed out. Many parts of the coalition treaty, they contain statements like, we will form a commission, and in a year's time we will come to an agreement, and then we will implement that. So it certainly won't be noticeable in the short term. If you remember 20 years ago when Gerhard Schröder implemented reforms, I think that took 3 years, 5 years. It's a slow burn, and ultimately, there will be some immediate effect. GDP will see an uptick because of government consumption going up, but you can't build a new railroad system overnight. You cannot rebuild every bridge overnight. You cannot digitize the German public infrastructure within a short period of time. I think there's a huge problem that a lot of departments will be involved. Defense, digital infrastructure, housing. So there will be diverging interests, and I think coordination will be very tricky. And that's also something that last week I attended an event at my old university, and Peter Altmaier was there, the former Minister of Finance as well as Economic Affairs, and he basically said for him it is crucial that these plans are coordinated. Otherwise, you just end up in a world where you're spending a lot of money without getting the desired effects. So we ran out of time, which is surprising because normally we wrap these events up early. So I hope I answered all of your questions. If not, please send them to me on LinkedIn, and I will get to you separately. And I'd like to thank you for your attention today, and I hope that I will see you again in roughly a month's time for the June edition of Real Talk Economics. Thank you so much, and have a good rest of the day. Bye-bye.